Hello, David. David, let's just check that we can hear you.
Hello, Emanuele. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I think we're all set. We have at this point 137 people watching us. So already, I think we're happy with that. We're going to start right now, as a matter of fact. So I am going to introduce our speaker and the event more broadly. My name is Emanuele Zaccarelli. I'm the Porteous Chair in the Political Science Department at San Diego State University. So but let me just immediately thank the Porteous Endowment as well as the Political Science Department and my chair, Jonathan Grobart, as well as the College of Arts and Letters in my university. Today, we're having a webinar discussing the question of the rise of fascism, the power in Germany, and the contemporary political lessons from those set of events. Our speaker is David North. I'm going to introduce him now. I'm very, very pleased to have you with us, David. David is what used to be called a public intellectual, someone who's been writing and intervening in political, intellectual discussions for a long time. He's the author of several books. I'll mention two that are my favorite, though they're not the most recent ones necessarily, but A Quarter Century of War, which details the sort of let's call them broken promises of what was going to happen after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Russian Revolution and the unfinished 20th century. David is the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, which also helped kind of advertise for this talk. And we're happy to have all the WSWS readers with us today. And if I could just end my introduction with a little bit of a personal anecdote, I remember vividly reading David's critical review of a book written by a political scientist, as a matter of fact, Daniel Goldhagen, on the Holocaust, and I was very struck. This was maybe over 20, maybe 25 years ago. I was very struck by that work. I think I translated it in Italian, and it's still available, both the original and the translation on the WSWS, which dealt with certainly some of the issues we're going to talk about today. So David, welcome to the webinar, and I'm very excited to have a discussion with you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I've rarely been described as a public intellectual, since I am not someone who is generally consulted in what passes for the public sphere. I've conducted my political work or intellectual work or theoretical work and practical work within the framework of a revolutionary movement. And to the extent that my theoretical work is of significance and relevance, I would hope that it is toward advancing the goal of building a revolutionary movement of the working class within the United States and internationally that will put an end to the capitalist system, and through that, putting an end to the enormous twin dangers of fascism and World War. I think perhaps in the past, a discussion of fascism, and I've engaged in many such discussions, would have been seen largely as a historical question. But now, and I think this is more and more broadly understood, it is acquiring and has acquired intense contemporary relevance, because I would imagine that those who are listening and those who will watch this program when we discuss fascism want to know whether we are confronted with fascism in the United States. More plainly, is Donald Trump a fascist? Do we have a fascist government? And first of all, if we do, what does that mean? What are the implications? Or even if we are approaching a situation where this existing administration may become a full-fledged fascist regime, what must we do to stop that from happening? So I think if we develop this, I mean, the way I will discuss this will be with the assumption that those who are listening are, of course, immensely concerned with what is presently happening in the United States and, in fact, beyond its borders. So, as an introduction, response to your introduction, let's begin.
So let me respond to your intro. No, I think you would be right to do so. I'm an educator. I'm teaching currently a class on fascism, but certainly we're not doing this purely in the spirit of academic curiosity. The hour is late. I think a lot of people understand that there's a very pressing political danger uh, looming, maybe more than looming right now in the United States and internationally. So I certainly want this conversation to be not simply an exploration of themes, but a political intervention in the present to especially thinking about some of my students who are themselves very concerned and quite um, uh, let's put it like this, they need some answers, and I think this is what we're going to try to do today. So let me ask you an initial question, which is very basic perhaps, but I think I would like you to give us your very fundamental basic understanding of what fascism is, being mindful that of course there's a generation that may be entering into politics or being dragged into politics perhaps, that have seen the word but may not entirely understand what it is as a political phenomenon. So it's as broad as that, if you could answer
Well,
that.
that is, I'll be frank, it is a very broad question. It is a very complicated question because we're dealing with a political phenomenon which now has a century of history behind it. The term fascism is used very widely, even more widely than the term fascism is the adjective fascist, usually and frequently followed by the reference to a particular animal. It is often used to describe a sort of political type with certain odious reactionary characteristics, racist, militaristic, and of course, to the extent that one is simply using the term descriptively, that's okay. But the issue from a serious political and I would say scientific standpoint, if one is going to develop a movement against fascism, one has to understand more precisely what it actually is. What is it, not simply as a reference to a certain type of individual, but what is it as a movement? What distinguishes fascism from other forms of political reaction? I mean, in the course of my political career and activity in the revolutionary movement, it began during the administration of Richard Nixon more than 50 years ago. And he was considered by many to be a fascistic type, but he was not a fascist leader. He was a reactionary, bourgeois, capitalist, political operative. Whether or not he had sympathies for fascism, and he certainly did. He certainly worked with fascists internationally, promoted their activities whenever he could, particularly in foreign policy, and also within the United States. But there was to describe him as a fascist leader would have been a mistake, because I think we have to understand when we talk about fascism, we're not just talking about individuals, we're talking about a movement. And therefore, the other question is, how does a fascist movement differ from other types of political forms of political reaction? There have been many reactionary regimes, and a good number of them have carried out horrific crimes, presided over regimes of conditions of massive political repression. But they were not necessarily fascist. That does not mean that when one discusses this, when one hears that a movement or a government is not fascist, one should breathe a sigh of relief and say, isn't that great? Well, at least we don't have fascism. There are many people who have and wound up in prisons and dungeons or have been assassinated by reactionary regimes that were not fascist. But I think when we discuss this, it is important because how we fight this, how we understand it, is very important, not just in terms of the struggle against fascism, but also other forms of political reaction. And I would just make the point that generally, when you have a fascist movement, it doesn't emerge in a pristine environment. Surrounding it, operating with it, are all sorts of other very reactionary forces which facilitate its emergence as the dominant political power. And by the way, if you ever want to stop what I'm, I sometimes have a tendency to go on at great length. So if you want to stop me for clarification, please, Emanuele, feel free to do that. But let me just go back, first of all, from the standpoint of a Marxist, and I think perhaps as an apology for my own sometimes lengthy answers, when you ask a Marxist for a definition, he doesn't sort of describe a thing, or he or she doesn't describe a thing. One tends to begin talking about a historical process. To understand a thing is to understand where it came from, how it developed, with what social conditions or economic conditions, political conditions is it associated. So if we're going to start a discussion of fascism, let's go back to when fascism really begins to emerge as a significant political presence in European and world history. And that really is in the aftermath of the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the end of the First World War, and the wave of revolutionary working class movements emanating from or inspired by Russia, but also reacting to the horrific experiences of the war, economic dislocation, extreme social distress, which led to the revolutionary radicalization of broad sections of the working class. And since you are of Italian background, you of course know that among the most important revolutionary movements of the immediate post-war period, well, there were, I'd say, two in particular, that in Germany, that in Italy, both countries, by the way, which had suffered serious defeats. And in the First World War, Italy ultimately was on the side of the winner, but dissatisfied with the outcome. But very much the conditions which developed in the aftermath of the First World War of extreme social distress instigated a profound radicalization and even revolutionary movement of the working class. I'll get to Germany later because there we're going from, let's say, the fascism in Italy to another form of even more virulent and horrifying fascism, the Nazi movement in Germany.
May I quickly, is it possible, because my second question was going to be to ask you to give an overview of the events that led to, in particular, Hitler's rise to power in Germany, and partly because that's how we set up the webinar. I understand the precedent in Italy is of great significance, but I'm asking you to perhaps kind of let's get to, can we start the story with the German case?
Well, I'd love to accommodate you, but that's very hard to do because, first of all, Hitler was himself inspired by Italian fascism. And when the Marxist movement begins to discuss fascism in the aftermath of Mussolini's rise to power, and I think I won't spend a lot of time on this because I know you do want to discuss Germany, and certainly it's of immense significance. But it is very important in framing it and actually understanding the present situation in the United States, because there's sort of a historical and political continuum from Mussolini's rise, so-called March on Rome in October 1922, and Hitler's accession to the chancellorship in Germany in January 1933. But what was distinctive about Mussolini's movement? Mussolini began, by the way, in the socialist movement. He abandoned the socialist movement during the First World War and moved over and adopted a virulent form of Italian nationalism, which he also dressed up with all sorts of social demagogic phrases. but certain characteristics of the fascist movement began to emerge. But the most distinctive element of Italian fascism was that it arose as a movement to suppress and beat back a radicalizing working class movement. There was a whole series of massive strikes in Italy in 1919, 1920, the most significant being the huge strike in Turin, I think it was in 1920. And first of all, the problem which emerged is that while there was huge radicalization and revolutionary fervor in the working class, there were immense factory occupations. There was also spreading radicalization of the peasantry. In other words, it was a movement which directly threatened the existing property of the Italian bourgeoisie, the wealthy landowners. If anyone's ever seen the film The Leopard, though it deals with an earlier historical period, the bourgeoisie was terrified by this movement. And it was a movement that should have led to the conquest of political power by the Italian working class. But the Socialist Party, the trade union leaders, were determined not to allow it to develop to that extent. They temporized, they entered into negotiations, and the actual outcome of all of this was that they demoralized and disoriented the working class. In this situation, Mussolini emerged as the leader of a militarized petty bourgeois movement consisting of clerks and small businessmen, elements of the lumpen proletariat, students, bourgeois students disturbed and worried about their future. In other words, all sorts of elements mobilized in the interests of capitalism under the leadership of what they call the combattiente, or the squadrons of black shirts, who went into trade union halls, broke up meetings, beat up workers. They went into peasant cooperatives, did the same. They went into universities when necessary and terrorized left-wing students. In other words, the mobilization of a mass movement whose specific aim was the annihilation and destruction of working class militancy, working class organizations. And what's very important to understand, and this will take us to the German experience, it was able to come to power under conditions in which the working class seemed to be incapable of carrying through a socialist solution to the very real crisis of capitalism. And this, the word fascism was with the Italian combined sticks, the fasces with an axe handle. It was something new. And I'd like to add one more point, and you'll see we'll get very much to the German experience. Well, one might say, well, what makes fascism different? Well, I said it's a mass movement resting on elements of the middle class, lumpen proletariat, demoralized workers. Its aim is the destruction of the working class movement, and it differs from other forms of reaction, which often take sort of Bonapartist regimes or traditional state-grounded reactionary parties, which function largely as on the basis of the existing apparatus of state violence, the military and the police. In other words, the fascist movement goes far beyond that, creates a genuine movement of mass terror. That was Mussolini's particular contribution to capitalist politics. Hitler, inspired by Mussolini, under somewhat similar, but also, you might say, even more extreme conditions, in the aftermath of, I'm sorry, I'm not always in control of who calls. Hitler came to power, and his movement emerged as a significant force in the aftermath, first of all, of the suppression of the German Revolution of 1919, then even more catastrophically, the revolution of 1923, when the possibilities in the midst of the complete collapse of the German economy, the possibilities of social revolution were so great that the bourgeois government in Germany was actually burning state papers. They expected to be overthrown. There was a plan for insurrection. The German working class was the most powerful working class in Europe. There was a mass communist party that was growing by the tens of thousands almost every single day. The social democracy was increasingly discredited. There was a plan for insurrection. Actually, it was planned to take place on the 6th anniversary of the October Revolution, October 25th, 1923 in Germany. And at the last moment, frankly, the leadership had cold feet, called it off. And the German socialist movement never really recovered. The expectation, the enthusiasm was dissipated. The bourgeoisie had time to pull itself together. There was time for the Americans to intervene heavily to provide financial stability to German capitalism, and the situation was stabilized. During that time, the fascist movement, which had already emerged under Hitler's leadership, also went into decline. His attempted coup failed in November in Munich. But in 1928, 29, 30, when the world crisis resumed, the economic crisis exploded once again, and you had a general collapse of the German economy, fascism once again began to grow very rapidly. And here we come to the central issue. How and why did Hitler come to power?
Perfect. So let me pause for a second, and it's very likely you would have put the spotlight on this issue, regardless. But let me just make sure that this is also addressed as you continue to tell the story. So there's often very kind of glib and popular conceptions about Hitler coming to power. One often hears, well, he came to power democratically. And or the assumption that this is back to the Goldhagen book, that the Germans were just desperate to give power to Hitler, but particularly the issue of the kind of the extent to which Nazism kind of participated in and used the kind of the constitutional and democratic framework that existed. So if you could kind of also discuss that is the relationship between the legal path to power of Hitler, if there was one, and the kind of extra constitutional, extra legal path. And I'm asking this in particular because I think in the contemporary situation, that some of these issues can come up very immediately. We have, after all, let's say, an elected president, and there's definitely ways in which the existing constitutional and democratic norms are very seriously being strained. But I think there may be some confusion generally about whether this fascism has to kind of take the form coming to power of a putsch, or whether it can be done in a different way.
Well, I mean, as a matter of historical fact, Hitler did not come to power in a putsch. He had attempted a putsch in 1923. It was unsuccessful. It was fired on by the police, and he narrowly escaped with his own life. He was afterwards treated with kid gloves. He was put in a very comfortable prison, not really a prison in terms of his conditions, where he wrote Mein Kampf. And for a number of years, his movement remained on the fringes of German politics until about 1930. As a matter of historical fact, Hitler did not shoot his way into power. As I was about to say, one of the lessons he drew from 1923 is he did not want to find himself in a confrontation with the organized forces of the German state, the German military. He felt this would be disastrous. And in fact, within his own movement, there were elements around Röhm and others who strongly disagreed with Hitler on this and were much more in favor of attempting the seizure of power. At the same time, I think it's also important to understand that German democracy was itself on its last legs. More and more, while there was still the forms of parliament, the government, particularly under Brüning, assumed more and more the character of a military dictatorship. Brüning, who was chancellor, I think, until the end of 1932, or near the end of 1932, ruled on the basis of decrees. He could take decisions apart from and without the approval of the German Reichstag, the German parliament. And so you had, for a substantial period of time, an erosion of democratic forms. During this period, however, the class struggle intensified. Now, to the issue, which I think is referenced about the fascist movement, it no doubt became a mass movement. But the Hitler movement, even after Hitler's party in 1932 became the largest party in the Reichstag, Hitler never actually achieved a parliamentary majority. Germany more and more was divided into two armed camps. There was the fascist movement led by Hitler, the Nazi Party, the National Social Democratic, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, is German acronym. And there were two major working class parties, both of whom were ostensibly committed to achieving socialism. Both of them, or their combined strength, was in the millions. That was the Socialist Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party. When you compare these two forces, even taking into account Hitler's large militarized force in the SA, the Sturmabteilung, it was never a majority. But even more significantly, one could not really compare the strength of the Nazi movement to the strength of the working class movement simply by counting numbers. Trotsky once made the point that 1,000 workers in a factory, or even a few hundred workers in a factory, in a critical position in production, is more important than 10,000 Nazis, their wives, and mother-in-laws. He referred to the Nazi movement as, to a great extent, human dust. He meant by that was the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpen proletariat, the demoralized jetsam and flotsam produced by capitalist society, was negligible as a socioeconomic force. The working class, by virtue of its position in the factories, in the critical areas of the economy, was a massive political force. But what was the problem? It was twofold. First, the Social Democratic Party, which was the larger of the two parties, had long since abandoned the perspective of social revolution. It had completed its transformation from a party of social revolution to social reform as far back as 1914, when it supported providing the bourgeois government with funds to enter what became the First World War. It abandoned a revolutionary orientation, and more and more openly and directly, it devoted its energies to the suppression of a revolutionary movement. It did so in the name of preserving democracy, which it declared, or bourgeois democracy, the perfection of bourgeois democracy, which it can now claim to be the fundamental task of the working class, and abandoning a revolutionary perspective. And toward this end, particularly in 1918 and 1919, when it held power after the collapse of the German army and the end of the World War, it legitimized and presided over the suppression of the German Revolution, and in fact, the murder of Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht. The Communist Party emerged in that period in 1918, 1919 out of the Spartacus Bund as the representative of the most revolutionary elements in the working class. It too became a substantial party. However, as a consequence of the Stalinization of the Communist Party and the disorientation of the Communist Party under the leadership of Stalin and the bureaucracy, that had a profound effect on the Communist International and subsequently on the Communist Party in Germany. The basic problem, however, you had two political parties. Collectively, they represented a massive strength. The Stalinists developed the position and this came, I know there's a lot of information, it's hard to tie it all together, but they advanced the claim that the Social Democratic Party, which certainly conducted itself in a reactionary character, was no different than the Fascist Party. They called the Social Democrats social fascists, and in doing so, ignored the very profound difference in the social base of the two movements. Social democracy sought to maintain and defend capitalism on the basis of limited reforms, palliatives for the working class. The task of fascism was to annihilate the working class movement and save capitalism by destroying every fragment of working class democracy, even the social democracy itself. The trade unions controlled. In other words, regardless of the treacherous role of social democracy, the aim of the Hitler movement was for once and for all to put an end to the influence of socialism in any form in Germany, to destroy all existing organizations of the working class, to annihilate every element of working class democracy and the culture associated with it, and as Hitler himself declared, to exterminate Marxism in Germany. They were two profoundly different movements. And therefore, Trotsky stressed and insisted that if fascism was to be stopped, it required that the Communist Party, notwithstanding its fundamental differences with the social democracy, its hostility to social democratic reformism, and its justified bitterness against the repressive measures which the Social Democrats had frequently taken against the working class, that still it was a task of the communists to offer the Social Democrats a united, to participate in a united front for the purpose of the defense of working class organizations against the Nazi threats. It was not a matter of sacrificing the program of the Communist Party, but insisting that fascism was a mortal threat to every section of the working class, and therefore it was necessary to unify in combat the social forces of the vast working class in Germany against the Nazis. That was also critical in exposing the refusal of the social democracy to actually accept the necessity of a unified struggle against fascism. Refusing to advance what Trotsky called the United Front, the Communist Party, again, functioning on a purely descriptive level, doing a catalog of all the crimes the Social Democrats had committed, took the position that social democracy was nothing more than another branch of fascism. In fact, they proceeded to call the Social Democrats social fascists. And in doing so, eliminated the possibility of a unified struggle of the working class against the Nazis. And in fact, Hitler came to power on that basis. In fact, even worse, or associated with it, the Communist Party developed the slogan, "After Hitler, us," which, as Trotsky said at the time, what a confession of bankruptcy. They're announcing in advance that they can't stop Hitler, and they're actually attributing to Hitlerite fascism a progressive character, because if Hitler leads to socialism, he can't be that bad. And that was the position which they were taking. Again, just to stress, and I think just would give you a background, Trotsky during this period, he had been exiled from the Soviet Union. He was on the island of Principe in the Sea of Marmara off the coast of Istanbul in Turkey. And 1,500 miles away from Germany, he wrote the most profound and brilliant analyses of the German situation. Essays titled, "What Next? Germany, the Last Warning. Germany, the Key to the Situation. The Only Road." He warned again and again that fascism was a massive threat, that if it were to come to power, it would be a catastrophe, not only for Germany, for German Jewry. He predicted that one of the outcomes of the victory of fascism would be the physical extermination of European Jewry. He saw this more clearly than anyone. But he said it would make world war inevitable. So before we get into perhaps the lessons of this, if you want me to clarify certain points, I'll be glad to do that.
Yeah, well, I'll just maybe United Front. This was going to be one of my questions. I'll give you a little anecdote of what happened in this class I'm teaching on fascism. Some student, then we'll get back to the historical point. But some students asked me if they could make an announcement. It was something generally about the defense of immigrants. At my university, we're kind of in the dark, but these reports are coming out that international students' visas are being withdrawn, and we're kind of it feels like it's coming quickly. It's not just the Cornells and the Harvards, also to our campus. But these students kind of gave a little presentation in class about defending immigrants on campus, and interestingly, they say we want to quote united front, and I was taken aback because this phrasing has a very specific historical meaning. I think I understood what they meant. But in any case, one of my questions was going to be to the present, like is the Trotsky insisted on the necessity for a united front to stop the fascists from taking power and more. I was just wondering, one, if you could say more about the political logic of his call for the united front, that is the different things he was seeking to achieve. And two, I'm very interested in this, what is this call for a united front applicable today? Because and this also has to do with the organizations that existed back then and perhaps don't exist today.
Well, the question of the united front, I mean, it is a very fundamental question. The strategy of the united front had initially been elaborated in discussions in the Comintern in and around the time of Mussolini's rise to power, drawing the lessons. The United Front, as developed in the Communist International, the third and fourth Congress of the Communist International, and then later by Trotsky, had to do with organizing the unified action of mass working class parties. It was not, first of all, a adaptation of the communist movement to the reformist and even reactionary politics of the social democracy. It took back none of its criticisms, but it agreed that the organizations had to conduct common defensive actions against the threat posed by fascism, and which often took a directly military form. How do you protect working class meetings? How do you prevent the violent attacks of the Nazi gangs, of the brown shirts, and so on, as they were called? How do you organize joint defense within factories? This is very different for something quite different, and often is raised in discussions which come up today, in which the concept of the united front is abandoned, and what is substituted for it is something which actually should be called a popular front, which is not the unified action of working class organizations, but the subordination of the working class to political alliances with the organizations and parties of the ruling class. And concretely in America, that is, as it's advanced by countless pseudo-left radical organizations, perhaps the most notorious and well-known of these is the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is sort of nothing more than a secondary agency of the Democratic Party, that it proposes to oppose the right on the basis of an alliance with the Democratic Party. I mean, presently, Bernie Sanders is traveling around the country, claiming that he's leading a fight against the billionaire class, against the oligarchy. Significantly, he's attracting a huge audience, which certainly demonstrates that there is a desire to fight, and we'll come back to this because I think it's very critical. There is, people are coming to his meetings because he has some sort of identification with socialism. But what he is proposing is that the threat of fascism and the threat of dictatorship, the dominance of the oligarchy, be opposed through the Democratic Party. That is, what does that mean? And I think this point has to be made in its most fundamental. Fascism is the militarization of the most extreme forms of reaction, counter-revolution in the interests of capitalism, in the interests of private property, in the interests of the profit system. To oppose fascism at its roots is to oppose the economic foundations upon which fascism develops and to which fascism is committed. The fascist movement in power, regardless of its demagogy, and Hitler is the best example of this, is a regime which enforces in the most brutal fashion capitalist exploitation. And one could argue that the most extreme form of that exploitation were the concentration camps themselves. The death camps, everything was exploited, even the skin and the hair of the individuals, the Jewish victims of Nazi atrocities. So that's so the United Front is an alliance based on the working class. The Popular Front is the subordination of the working class to the ruling class. It's political organizations, which in fact means the crippling of any serious struggle against fascism. And of course, that's being excuse me, expressed today in the political situation that we presently confront. And if we can get to the question of Trump, I hope that would be your next question. Is Trump a fascist? Well, if one wants to use a purely descriptive appraisal of Trump, I am sure he would feel completely at home with Adolf Hitler. It has been reliably reported many times that Mein Kampf is his bedtime reading. His views are as reactionary and as putrid as those that you would find among any member of the communist of the Nazi Party, including Hitler himself. And moreover, if one examines the policies that he is carrying out, his assault on democratic legal structures, his ruthless and vile persecution of immigrants for whom he is scapegoating, for all the problems which exist in American society, and his efforts to eradicate even intellectual and cultural opposition to his regime, which is a regime, no doubt, a capitalist regime. He lacks one thing. He has many of the, there's a lot about Trump's movement and Trump himself, which smells of fascism. It has that particular odor, or I might say stink. But what he lacks is a mass movement. He does not, at this point, have at his disposal a mass movement of demoralized, embittered, petty bourgeois, middle class elements, lumpen proletariat, stirred into rage against socialism and communism. Quite the opposite. I think if one looks at the present situation, and this is, I think, is the most profound difference, both within the United States and internationally, in the midst of an escalating crisis of the world capitalist system, which everyone acknowledges, there are clear signs that we have entered a period of growing radicalization of the working class, where the working class, on the basis of its experience, is beginning to look for an alternative to the existing socioeconomic order. Putting it plainly, they want to get rid of the oligarchs. That's how it first emerges. They have a sense that power is now in the hands of a ruling elite, which is stuffed with money, that has vast resources, vast wealth, while they are finding it difficult, workers are finding it difficult to pay for the basic necessities of life. Everything is difficult. The working class is moving to the left. I think that is the dominant movement from below. It's not the bubbling up of this, we don't go on the streets and see brown shirts with swastikas roaming the streets and beating up people who are associated with working class struggle. They can't mobilize, massive gangs of fascists to suppress strikes. For that, they rely on the trade union bureaucracy. Now, having said that, my aim is not for everyone to say, we can breathe a sigh of relief, because what it really means is we have an opportunity. The initiative, examined objectively, can be with the working class. Not only because we see radicalization here, we see this internationally, and the working class is a vastly, vastly larger force than it was 90 years ago. We've seen a vast growth of the global proletariat in parts of the world where it didn't even exist as recently as a half century ago. On a world scale, the economic significance, the productive significance of the working class is vastly greater. The problem, and this is what must be solved, is that this objective strength must find political expression. There is immense anger in the United States, if we can concentrate right now on the American situation. But we know, and this is of course bound up with the decades and decades of the encouragement of every form of political backwardness, cultural backwardness, all of which is associated with anti-communism, promoted by the media, promoted by the state. There's immense political confusion. But if that confusion isn't overcome, then the social struggles will be set back, and there's always the danger that the process of demoralization can facilitate the rise of a genuine fascist movement. People begin to look not toward the left, but toward the right for answers. That's the danger which we confront. And we must confront that danger or overcome it by building a revolutionary party. I mean, that's the aim of the Socialist Equality Party. And that's the aim of the World Socialist website. I want to be as blunt to those who are listening. If you want to fight, you have to understand what you're fighting. You have to turn to the working class. But turning to the working class is not just sort of something you do with a compass. It means that you take up a fight for Marxist consciousness in the working class, for the development of class, scientifically grounded class consciousness, that you build up within the workplaces, within the factories, a cadre of socialist workers. Now, we know that's possible. In the last UAW election, we ran a candidate for the presidency of the UAW, Will Lehman, and he got the votes of 5,000 auto workers, and he ran explicitly as a socialist. So anyone who tells you the workers won't ever support socialism, they don't know what they're talking about. They never spoke to a worker in a serious way. So that's what we put forward, and it is, we think that in the upheavals which are now developing, the possibility of developing a revolutionary party in the United States on the basis of an international perspective, under conditions in which we are seeing struggles unfolding all over the world. And the processes which I have described in the United States are by no means unique. The working class is an international class. I mean, just on this point of Trump's tariffs, they're not popular among American workers. Workers know that the commodities they create in the factories are the product of an international division of labor. The working class is objectively connected in the process of production. The people of every country are objectively connected. Every time you use your cell phone, you have in your hand a device which is the product of the labor of workers all over the world. This is an objective fact. So the prospect of international unity, the prospect of the reorganization of the world economy, not on the basis of war, the incitement of national hatreds, brutal annexations, but on the basis of socialist solidarity and socialist revolution, is very real. That's the perspective we put forward and the conclusions we draw from history.
Thank you, David. Listen, I wanted to make a point. We have well over 200 attendees at the present. We're gonna move on to some questions and answers, take some questions from the audience in a minute. I have a couple more questions for you, which relate to some of the points that have already come up. The first one is this business of the basically the question of anti-capitalism, for lack of a better term, back to the historical situation. In other words, the ability of the Nazis to develop a kind of a mass constituency required making certain anti-capitalist claims or noises, which some of them perhaps even believed. So I wanted to ask you if you could give us some account of what form this took in Germany, but also, of course, slingshot back to the present. And if you could tell us whether you see, it, odd as this may sound, like if this sort of anti-capitalism of the most kind of unsubstantial sort, if any of this can be found on the right and sort of in the Trump administration, and what the danger of that may be.
Well, I think the one of the critical elements of all fascist movements is their extreme nationalism. And the proposal of all, the advancing of all sorts of really miraculous cures to the elements of capitalism on a national basis. At times, and this was certainly true among certain elements, even around the Nazi Party, this was given a certain fraudulent socialist coloration. But the national element ultimately is a defense of national capitalism. And in every case where these right-wing movements emerge, they are inseparable, or they are absolutely hostile to socialism, to a socialism based on the struggle of the working class, and above all, on a socialism which advances the international unity of the working class. Because socialism is, if it's anything else, it's a system of the international organization of economy under the leadership of a global class, the working class. In the case of Trump, I mean, his, when you look at Trump's policies, and this element has a very distinctive fascistic character, his tariffs. He's promising a renewal. I mean, the slogan, "Make America Great Again," that has a fascist character, to return to some sort of mythical past that never was. But in fact, what he is trying to do is to recover and reestablish and retain the dominance of American capitalism against all its competitors. I mean, also, you might say that Trump can be understood in the framework of gangsterism. I mean, what does the mafia do when it can't pay its debts? It either robs a bank or it kills the person to whom it owes the money. Both elements, of course, are present in Trump. In the case of Trump, the robbing takes the form of the imposition of tariffs, and the killing, it takes the form at this point of seizing people, grabbing them, and sending them very possibly to their deaths in concentration camps located at this point in El Salvador. And if you heard what Trump had to say yesterday in the White House when he was talking to the El Salvadorian gangster, he said he wants to deal with the homegrowns, that is, American citizens. So, the socialist element that's totally absent from Trump, but it has it always has had a fraudulent character because the nature of fascism is the defense of private property, and it is totally hostile to the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, and it's totally hostile to the perspective of international working class solidarity.
Thank you. So I'm just gonna tell our audience that if this might be a good time to put some questions in the chat because we're gonna pose some of those to our speaker. Now I'm gonna ask one last question, and again, feel free to roam from the past in Germany to the present today, but and maybe it's a little specific, but I was wondering if you had anything to say about what the Nazis did, let's say, to the universities or in the universities. Of course, the kind of the student population, the sociology of that back then, even in Germany, must have been quite different. But obviously, I'm asking this because I think we're likely to have a lot of students in our audience, and I think the universities are also bearing the brunt of this right-wing offensive by the.
Well, I mean,
But
if you want to know what Hitler did, let's talk about what Trump's doing because he's working right off of the Nazi playbook. I mean, his advisors, particularly people like Stephen Miller, as I said, he's views himself as a sort of born-again Joseph Goebbels. Stephen Bannon, these are people who have studied their Hitler, studied their Nazi movement. They may not have the mass social base, but they certainly believe that they can implement this. And what has he been doing? First of all, he is essentially, Trump is proceeding now completely illegally. There is no, the constitutional framework does not exist for him. He is not restrained by any sort of constitutional norms, legal norms. As we have written in the World Socialist website, he's working off of the conceptions which were associated with the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, the so-called state of exception. The Führer makes the laws. He has the power. He does with it what he wants. And this has been ratified, in a sense, by the Supreme Court. And it's not encountering any significant opposition within the Congress. It is encountering opposition within the population. There's no doubt about it. And I just before this meeting began, I watched a confrontation between Iowa Senator Grassley and his constituents in a town meeting, and they were incensed by Trump's violation of the rights of immigrant and migrant workers. And interestingly enough, if I could just, we have explained in the very excellent articles written by Comrade Eric London on the World Socialist website, he's made the point that the Constitution grants and the Civil War amendments are very, very specific, that all the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are guaranteed to all people in America. It says nothing about having to be a citizen. When you come to America, you're on American soil. You must be treated according to the laws of the United States. You have due process. You have freedom of speech. When tourists arrive in the United States, they're not told or haven't been told up until now that if you think a nasty thought that we don't like, we can not only throw you out of the country, we can fling you into a concentration camp. That is an invention, I'm sure, which is entirely compatible with anything which Hitler thought of. So you have this massive attack. What is taking place in the universities right now is very much based on what they called in the period of Hitler in German Gleichschaltung, a leveling out of and equalization or establishment of a certain type of uniformity. And it should be pointed out that the burning of books, the infamous event of May 1933, took place just about 4 months after Hitler had come, 3.5 to 4 months after Hitler had come to power. And it took place across the street, literally, from Humboldt University, the most prestigious and famous, among the most famous universities in Germany. So there are many comparisons which can be drawn and which we're seeing each day in the United States. This is a government which is absolutely determined to eradicate democratic rights, to transfer power unilaterally to the president. And again, there is growing opposition to this. I want to make the point that it has been prepared. I mean, it didn't just happen overnight. If I can refer to our own history, back in the election of 2000, an election which was stolen, the final act of the theft of the election was the decision of the Supreme Court to stop the counting of ballots, knowing that the counting of ballots in the state of Florida would result in the ratification of Gore's victory. Now, just before that decision was announced, the SEP and the World Socialist website stated that the decision of the Supreme Court would reveal to what extent there remained within the ruling elites a serious commitment to the defense of bourgeois democracy. There was no such commitment. And what we saw afterwards, the Patriot Act, targeted assassinations, Abu Ghraib. I mean, what's going on in El Salvador was anticipated by Abu Ghraib. All of this has been prepared and is now taken a sort of qualitative leap. So the events which are now unfolding in the United States, yes, they bear many resemblances to events that took place. And one final point I just want to stress, again, going back to the meeting yesterday in the White House, when I read about that, and Trump said to Carte, the Salvadorian leader, Bukele, he said to him, "We need 5 of these places for the homegrowns." Well, what does that recall? Dachau. Hitler came to power in January. Work on Dachau concentration camp began in March. The first people sent to the Dachau concentration camps were communists and socialists. It soon was expanded, and it became ultimately part of a massive network of concentration camps to which not only Jews were sent, gypsies were sent, but hundreds of thousands of German political opponents of the Nazi regime. And that clearly, when I said that, Trump has Dachau on his mind, that's what he's thinking about. No one mistake that. And I don't think I could express that fact alone should impart to our discussion of fascism and its contemporary relevance the greatest urgency.
Absolutely. So, David, maybe it's time now to take some questions from the audience. Let me see what we have here. I'm gonna thank Nakai and Joseph, my student assistants, for kind of helping me with this. So there's a very earnest question. I'm gonna pose it, give you a chance to kind of say more about the political program that you're advancing here. It just goes like this from Greg. What is the best way to convince workers of their collective strength against Trump's fascist movement?
Well, I think you can convince them in the very process of organizing their struggle. First of all, explaining very clearly what the political situation is, showing the relationship of the political situation to their own economic struggles, explaining the source of the economic source of the problems which they confront, and demonstrating clearly, I mean, when workers, I think workers have a sense that they have great strength. I mean, if one's ever seen, every time workers go out on strike, they have a sense of their strength, but they're immediately confronted with the fact that those who are supposed to be leading them will not will do everything they can to suppress the struggles. The trade unions do not function as organs of class struggle. The bureaucracies which control these organizations are hostile to every effort by the working class. The bureaucracy itself is part of the more affluent sections of the upper middle class. Many of these people earn six-figure salaries or upper six-figure salaries and even higher. The head of the UAW is a supporter of tariffs, which means he's a supporter of the disunity of the international working class. The idea, I mean, he's basically conveying to American workers that Canadian workers and Mexican workers are their enemies. And he says, quite frankly, that he sees tariffs as a means of preparing America for military conflict. So these organizations suppress the working class, but the workers have a sense of their enormous strength. What they don't yet understand is how that strength can be mobilized and utilized. I mean, when a program is advanced before workers, they'll say, "It's great, I agree, but how do we get that done? You know, how can I get other workers to agree with me?" So that is obviously a very, very challenging political struggle that has to be taken up. And but the interaction of the fight for a socialist understanding of society and its continuous relationship to the struggles of the working class, you have to go to the factories, you have to go to the workplaces and convince workers of this. I just want to make the point right now. In the last days, the president of Harvard sent a letter informing Trump that Harvard, at long last, would not go along and accept government control over the university. Now, it's about time. It would be a mistake, however, to rely upon the administration of Harvard to carry through any serious struggle. Harvard's administration is tied by hundreds of thousands of threads to the military, to the financial interests. And we know that he only acted under the enormous pressure of students and faculty. But what would really change the situation would be the intervention of the working class in that fight. For the working class to not only support the students and the faculty, but utilize its potential power to take the lead in the fight for democratic rights, and to, through that, ever more clearly define the struggle as a struggle against the capitalist system. You can't have democracy and oligarchy. You can't have democracy and massive social inequality. After all, you know, what is the final, what in the final analysis, what does the oligarchy want? It wants to protect its wealth. It wants to make sure that that wealth is not challenged, that all the resources of society remain under its control, and it will give up nothing. So I think that understanding has to be brought into the working class. And the working class has a rich workers will fight, they have to fight.
Thank you, David. Let me pick up on let me read another question. This one comes from Chloe Aquino. There's some connections to the previous question, but here we go. If Trump presently lacks the mass movement component of fascism, at what point does his fan base constitute a mass movement? They have voted him in, and while they may not overtly silence the working class movement in the same way as before, this is interesting, this part, it is increasingly, quote, looked down upon for young people to identify as leftist.
Well, again, first of all, the mass rallies which are taking place for Sanders, and we don't accept that Sanders is a socialist, but people are going to those rallies because he, in a certain sense, appeals to a certain elementary sympathy. To the extent that he's seen as a socialist, people believe that means he's against the existing economic system and its domination by an oligarchy. I mean, he spoke to 20,000 people in Utah, 10,000 people in, I think it may have been Idaho, I'm not quite sure, but it was and in the course of that meeting, by the way, at which Sanders was speaking, a flag was unfurled in support of the Palestinians, which produced a mass ovation. And Sanders, to his, the man who put out that banner was arrested, and to his absolute shame, Sanders did not immediately demand that the individual be released and be left alone, that he had a right to declare his position. Now, just to come back to the question of mass movement, I think it's pretty well understood that Trump did not win the election by telling people that he was going to take measures that would slash their living standards. One can be fairly certain that substantial numbers of workers who've lost their jobs in the last few weeks as a result of his shutting down of government jobs voted for Trump. He lied to them. He took advantage of them. He exploited their frustration over the policies of the Democratic Party, which is fixated on issues of war. And he exploited that, got their support, and now they're finding out that what he said he was has nothing, or what he said he would do has nothing to do with what they want. And his escalation of attacks on democratic rights is certainly bound up with his own realization that it is very unlikely that he could win another election or even a congressional election. So people are going through a sort of change in their political evaluations. I mean, a massive, essentially anti-Trump rally in Utah, a state which he won overwhelmingly in 2016 or in 2020 and in 2024. What does that tell us? The American working class is undergoing a process of social and, I believe, political radicalization. And I think it would be helpful if, rather than constantly being dominated by skepticism over the possibility of winning the working class to socialism, begin fighting for it. I think then you'd be in a much better position to make an evaluation. I mean, you will find that workers are looking for an alternative. They have to find one now, given the attacks on their jobs, the living standards, all the massive threats to Social Security, education, healthcare. Is it so hard to believe that these processes are not going to radicalize workers and turn them against the capitalist system?
Thank you, Dave.
I think the problem is not so much that the workers don't believe in the possibility of socialism, but the level of skepticism and doubt, which is, in a certain sense, been produced by the relentless anti-communism, anti-socialism of the ruling elites and its media. And I just would make the point, if they were so convinced that no one wants socialism, why do they spend so much time denouncing it? I mean, consider the amount of energy and time and money spent on denouncing socialism. You would imagine that the socialist movement had 150 million members. I mean, why is the Socialist Equality subjected to censorship? Why is the World Socialist website massively censored by the search engines? I know from my own experiences, for example, with social media, that most of the people who follow me never get what I post. It's intercepted. I mean, there is a massive framework of censorship of socialist thought in this country, and but the radicalization of the working class and the growth of social struggles create the conditions for that being broken down.
Thank you, Dave. So we're going to take a couple more questions. I don't know if you have access to them, if you see them, if you're able to see them on the chat, but we're now receiving quite a few. I should also mention that we seem to have an international audience because we received kind greetings at the beginning from various countries, including the Netherlands and Norway and France. There is a question I'm seeing here, which is, well, I was seeing here. It was actually about Australian politics. If that, let me see. You know what? I can't find it. So we'll go with this one, Mark Taylor. It's still about Sanders, but I think there's plenty to say about that. But particularly because I think maybe there's young people who are now seeing these rallies that someone is made looks like is standing up to the oligarchy. But the circus come to town again. But in 2016, Sanders behaved in a certain way that I think is very instructive. Perhaps you could say a few words about that. The question is, Mark Taylor, what is your view of the role Senator Sanders' faux populism is playing in the rise of Trumpist fascism? I view him as a sheepdog to keep leftists in the Democratic Party flock and thus preventing a genuine working class movement.
Well, that's easy. He's answered the question for me. Sanders is a lightning rod. I mean, there are two ways. One could spend a fair amount of time going through Sanders' rather deplorable political history. I mean, he is, to use an old but highly relevant phrase, an out and out political opportunist. He, his role as the officially sanctioned independent is to make sure that no popular movement against Trump moves outside the boundaries of capitalist politics. That is the basic problem of the American working class. That is breaking with the Democratic Party, breaking with bourgeois politics, and organizing itself politically as a class with its own program. That is bitterly resisted and opposed by Sanders and his disciple Ocasio-Cortez. And after all, what has his role been in 2016? He attracted an enormous amount of support, and then he gave his support to Hillary Clinton. In 2020, he had even greater support, and he turned that over to Biden. And now, sure enough, as popular opposition begins to emerge under very fraught conditions, he is carrying out his tour. But he already had said that there were many areas where he wanted to work with Trump. He gave support for his immigrant policy. He speaks still to this day of having to secure our border. He speaks of Israel's right to defend itself, which means, in fact, to murder tens of thousands of Palestinians. He supports the NATO war in Ukraine. I mean, that's his record. Now, the working class will make, many such types of people emerge in an initial period of political radicalization. But the working class will make serious experiences with this person. It's important that we do not adapt to it, but counterpose a real socialist program to his efforts on behalf of the Democratic Party, and to make sure his functioning as a lightning rod, to make sure that this movement, which is developing, does not break outside the bounds of the Democratic Party.
Thank you, David. Well, let's answer one last question. The timing seems about right. So I'm gonna go with John Wilson's question. This is a historical question. Again, I don't know if you have access to it. It's a long text. So he's asking you to address the role of the trade unions in Germany in 1932-33. He then details a series of, to my knowledge, correct events having to do with calling of a general strike, and then being the leadership of all the unions making various deals with the Nazis, and finally being rounded up and arrested, he says, on May 2nd, 1933. And then, of course, this is a historical question about the unions then, but we are also, as the person asking, he also wants you to take it to the present about Sinn Féin and the behavior of the UAW leadership in relation to the Trump administration?
Well, that's a vast question, but I want to make just a simple point about this. As politically rotten as the social democracy was, it is simply impossible to compare the social democracy in Germany to the American trade union bureaucracy. The trade union bureaucracy in America has no historical association with socialism in any form whatsoever. It is, in fact, historically, the AFL-CIO emerged in its modern form as a result of a unification with the CIO, which was predicated on the ruthless purge of all socialist militants from positions of leadership in the trade unions. There were no more enthusiastic supporters of McCarthyism and than the labor bureaucracy. And anyone who has had any serious experience on doing nothing more than selling a left-wing newspaper in front of a factory knows that in doing so, you always had to reckon with the possibility that you would be physically attacked by union thugs, organized by the bureaucracy, who conducted themselves no differently than fascists would. And I believe there's good reason to one can be certain that in any fascist movement, a substantial section of that movement will consist of trade union bureaucrats who are anti-communist, nationalists. They have no historical association with socialism in any form. The German social democracy had an entirely different history. It was a revolutionary movement which abandoned its socialist roots. Its historic betrayal took place the infamous date of August 4th, 1914, when it abandoned its historic pledge to oppose the entry of Germany into war, to meet that with resistance by the working class, and voted war credits. That set into motion a process of political decay. But the social democracy still was a mass working class organization. It was in its organizations, ultimately, though it wanted to evade that fact, were incompatible with fascistic rule. You can't simply make an equivalent. This is not in any way to diminish in the conditions of that time the reactionary role played by social democracy. But the American trade union bureaucracy, a substantial portion of it supports Trump, and those who claim to support the Democrats do so on Fain, the much beloved union official of the Democratic Socialists of America, dreams of making his own contribution, or wants the UAW to be at the forefront of turning America into the arsenal of the fight for global protectionism, and the reassertion of American dominance. That's, he said, it will make its necessary contribution to the remilitarization of American society and American production. So today, the fight for the political independence of the working class, for a socialist perspective, is bound up with a fight to transfer power from the bureaucracy to the shop floor. To the extent that the working class will be able to fight, it must break free from the political, organizational, structural control of unions dominated and controlled by bureaucracies. That's what it needs to do, and that's what we fight for. I just want to make sure we don't forget to make this point. On the 3rd of May, the International Committee of the Fourth International, with the participation of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, will be holding a May Day rally. Comrades, leaders of the International Committee of the Fourth International from all over the world will be speaking and discussing in detail the conditions which exist in the broader international strategy of the Trotskyist movement. So please make sure you register. Go to the World Socialist website, wsws.org, and register for our May Day rally and on the 3rd of May, so you can find out more about, continue the discussion and continue to educate yourself and join our movement. These are not, in the end, purely academic questions. These are questions of life and death. I think we all must sense, anyone who really is thinking about what's taking place, is the world is changing. And what will take place in the next over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, may very well decide the fate of humanity. Excuse
Thank
me,
you,
Michael.
David. That's our, I don't want to, well, that's excellent. Thank you very much. I'm gonna conclude by first of all thanking our speaker, David North. And I thought this was a fantastic and very necessary and pressing discussion. Since you mentioned the May Day rally, I'm also going to make a more general appeal for people to read the World Socialist website. In particular, I'm going to mention its coverage, and not just journalistically, but also that of the ongoing attacks against the universities, against the students, against the faculty. I think that is excellent work, and it also points is trying to make certain connections in terms of what is to be done about it. And then last point in that spirit, we also have at San Diego State, where I teach a chapter of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, of which I'm one of the 2 faculty advisor. And so I would, you know where to find me. If you want to be involved in that work as well, you can come see me. Once more, I'm going to thank all our attendees for this event and our speaker, David North. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.